Thank you, Colin, and thanks very much for inviting me and for coming. I think the title I'm talking about is traditional food, but I need to explain what's happening, I think, in terms of GM and the intensification of animal feed, which Tracy has already introduced. When I was a kid, I can quite clearly remember eating a piece of chicken that tasted like fish. And the reason for that was that it was fed fish meal. And we don't do that in this country anymore, but in places like Thailand, they certainly still use fish meal to feed chickens. Species like sardines, anchovies, sand eels, even herrings, they're all caught, churned up and turned into pellets and fed to chickens. In this country, we've moved on from there. We now, after a flirtation with animal protein, which was largely banned after the BSE outbreak, and then completely knocked on the head after the foot and mouth outbreak in 2001, we now moved on to soya beans. And this country's poultry and pig industry is entirely dependent on imports of soya beans for its protein. And we've bred our pigs to the point where they have to have a high protein diet because the producers, supermarkets, require them to be brought up very quickly. So the average broiler chicken, which is what you buy when you buy a chicken in a supermarket, exists for about 35 days now. And the reason it does that is because we pump it full of soya beans, very high protein feed, and it enables it to grow very, very fast. And that's the system. And in 1996, Monsanto, American multinational chemical corporation, going back 100 years, and involved in all sorts of nasty chemicals, including Agent Orange, which was sprayed on the forests of Vietnam by the US Air Force during the Vietnam War to kill off the trees so they could see the enemy better. And they moved in and started to produce genetically modified soybeans, which now dominate in places like Argentina, where about 98% of the area is under GM soya. In Brazil, the situation's slightly better. It's only about 70%. But countries like Paraguay, Uruguay, and Bolivia are slowly being taken over by GM soya. It's going to be extremely difficult to maintain non-GM soya supplies unless our supermarkets become more proactive about animal feed, because that's where it's coming through, slipping through the net into this country in large quantities, simply because people don't know it's there. Because when you buy your broiled chicken or your dozen eggs or your pork chop or your joint of beef, it doesn't tell you what it's being fed on. And if it was labelled fed on genetically modified soybeans, I'm sure that we'd be in a different position now regarding the supply of soya. So we're faced with this juggernaut of industrial agriculture, which Tracy's very well described. And it starts with companies like Monsanto, who have monopolistic control over the seed industry in South America. Pretty much all the seeds that are sold to Argentinian farmers come through Monsanto. Once it's harvested, it's moved through another set of companies, which you can say are A, B, C, and D: Archer Daniel Midland, Bunge, Cargill, and Dreyfus. And they basically control how these crops are shipped around the world in huge, great containers. And they come into ports like Rotterdam, where they're then transshipped out to the mills for conversion into animal feed. Monsanto didn't develop GM soybeans for the benefit of the world. They developed it because they needed it as a company. In 1970s, they found a chemical called glyphosate, which was very good at killing weeds. It kills the whole plant, so it's taken in by the leaves and it's taken right down to the tip of the root. So if you spray a dandelion, you kill everything, which with other herbicides, other weed killers, you may only kill the green parts on the top. So it was very, very popular with everybody, from farmers to gardeners to local authorities to rail track. Everybody thinks it's wonderful. I have been at meetings in the past where people said that you can put it on your cornflakes, it's so safe. The answer to that is, well, go on then, and we'll watch you eat them. But they never do, and the reason for that is because it's not safe. And independent scientists have been assessing the safety of glyphosate over the last 10, 20 years, really, and the evidence against it's building up, and that it is actually quite a damaging chemical. And in Argentina, we're now seeing birth defects in the people who are misfortunate enough to live next to the soya fields, because often these weed killers are sprayed from the air onto the soya crop. It means you get drift onto the communities, and we're seeing deformed children being born. It's also very, very toxic to amphibians. Frogs and toads are one of the most threatened species on the planet in terms of their habitats are being drained to make more room for intensive agriculture. But then in the little bits of wetland that are left to them, they then get sprayed with weed killers such as glyphosate. And it's very, very good evidence that it's very damaging to those creatures. And yet, it still gets approved by everybody worldwide. Everybody will approve it as safe. And part of the reason for that is because we've sort of institutionalised science in this country, whereas we've now got a block of scientists who believe that everything, that their analysis is correct, and they share their vision with Monsanto. So if a scientist comes along who challenges that assertions, they will be vilified. And we've seen lots of evidence of this over the years, where scientists are just pushed out by and pushed out of institutions for challenging the safety of basic chemicals, and become marginalised, and it becomes more and more difficult for them to publish papers. And when they do publish a paper which is critical of either GM or glyphosate, Monsanto have a team of tame scientists who come along and will write critiques of their work. However, there are a number of scientists who are now beginning to stand up and say this is a dangerous chemical and we need to review whether we should be using it on animal feed, because it will certainly get into the animal feed and then potentially into milk, cheese, eggs, meat. And one of the things that's emerged recently is also it's getting into water supply. If you read the Monsanto website, it's completely safe. It won't go into water supply. It locks into the soil. But in fact, the Americans of Geological Survey have now been looking in rivers in the Midwest where glyphosate is sprayed extensively on Roundup GM crops. And they're finding about 1% of the Roundup that's sprayed ends up in the rivers. And recently there was a published paper from Spain which showed that Roundup is turning up in Spanish groundwater, something that Monsanto would say was impossible because it simply will lock onto the soil and remain there. But the evidence is that it remobilises quite a lot. And once it's back into the soil water, it will wash down below the roots and get into groundwater and drains and go into rivers. So the evidence against this system of production is enormous, and but we're having great difficulty in getting this government, the European Union, the American government to take any notice of the information about the safety of it. However, it is beginning to crumble, because the history of pesticides in the world is if you overuse pesticides, the pests get resistant to them. And that is exactly what's happening to weeds in the GM soya belts, in the GM maize belts, and in the GM cotton belts of America and South America. The weeds have evolved to become resistant to Roundup. And in South America, there's a weed called Johnson grass, which is originated in the Mediterranean, and it was brought in by ranchers because it's incredibly vigorous grass, and they thought it'd be good for fodder. In fact, it was good for feeding cattle, but when you turn your cattle land into arable land, it becomes a very, very difficult weed to get rid of. And originally, when Monsanto came along with Roundup Ready and glyphosate sprays, everybody said, fantastic, it will control the Johnson grass. And it did for about 3 years, and then the Johnson grass caught up with and evolved naturally, and now they've got a major problem with hundreds of thousands of acres of GM land being infested with this resistant weed. So they're having to bomb it with even more chemicals. So that's the story of intensive agriculture. You solve one problem, you create another, and on it goes. And in America, we've now got to the state in the cotton belt, in the Roundup Ready cotton belt, where there's one weed in particular called Palmer amaranth, which is can grow this high and produces millions of seeds. It's completely out of control. And the only way that, if it gets above this sort of height, then the only way you can control it is to employ cheap labour to go around pulling it by hands and take it away in a cart. which is sort of 1930s type agriculture. So the whole thing is crumbling. And yet the solution, of course, to everybody in the industrial agricultural world is more chemicals. Bomb with more chemicals. Cocktails of chemicals, mixtures of chemicals, chemicals that act on the soil before seeds come out of the ground. So this is where, so we're going to see an intensification as a result of chemical use as a result of GM. So what should we do? I mean, Tracy and Colin have outlined very clearly what needs to be done. We need to take a whole look at the whole system and how we actually produce our animal proteins in the world, and change that, because it's the system that's wrong. At the moment, we've got soybeans thousands of miles away in South America feeding pigs in Humberside, and there's absolutely no way that you can recycle the manure from those pigs back onto the land in South America where the soybeans were growing. Now, the other day, I just did a little calculation. For every 1 million tonnes of soybeans we import, which is about 3 million tonnes a year, I think we import from South America into this part of the world, about 12,000 tonnes of phosphates come with it, which means eventually you'll strip out all the phosphates in South American soil, put them through pigs in this country, and most of that will go out through our sewage works into the North Sea. And so we'll be transferring phosphates from one part of the world to the other in a way that's entirely unsustainable, because phosphate is a limited resource. The price is going off the scale on the world market, and a lot of farmers are already starting to cut back on how much phosphate they use because they simply can't afford to put it on anymore. Poor farmers who would actually might benefit from a bit of phosphate in Africa and parts of South America, because their soils are naturally depleted in phosphate, they can't afford to buy it. So we need to change the whole system so it enables us to return all our organic waste, sewage and everything back onto the land where the feed was grown in the first place. So that means starting to grow feed which is locally. And traditionally, that would have been a bit of barley and a bit of beans and a bit of pig swill, which is waste food, which is boiled up to a high temperature and then fed to pigs. But unfortunately, that was banned in 2001 after the foot and mouth outbreak, for no reason other than that the government needed somebody to blame for the foot and mouth outbreak. So it got banned, and now we have a huge waste food problem, whereas before we didn't. And so we need to start lobbying to get that looked at again and make sure that we get systems in place that safeguard health of pigs and people. But indeed, it's closing the cycle, which is what we have to do. Everything has to be cycled in this small planet. And if we don't cycle, then we'll end up with soils which are stripped to their basic nutrients, and farmers will be paying huge sums of money for what rock phosphate is available, and will be converted by chemical companies again into superphosphate in fertilizers, and it will end up in a holy mess. And the idea of it being sustainable or intensive sustainability is a joke, because our soils simply cannot take that sort of exploitation any longer. So we have to return to a system where the pigs and the chickens become part of that cycle rather than the end of a pipe. Because at the moment, we've got a pipe that starts in South America and a farm in Humberside, and it's a throughput system, and we have to close that loop. If we don't, then we're stuffed. And I don't see any evidence that the sustainable intensification lobby are addressing those issues at all. And if they don't, then we'll be having the same conversation, only more urgently, in 10 years' time. Right, I think it's 10 minutes up. Thank you.